Researchers, you've been doing some really hard work lately, synthesizing information across texts, combining that information together to determine main ideas about your subtopics and topics. Since this work is really challenging, I thought that I would offer you one more way this unit that you might try this, and that is to compare and contrast what authors say and how they say it. So today I want to teach you that researchers read a few sources on a topic. They compare and contrast those texts, noticing how they portray the topic in similar ways and how they are different. Then they speculate about why authors made these craft and structure decisions. Thinking, does this relate to the main ideas they're teaching? So I'm going to show you how I do this using one text that's pretty familiar and another text that's not quite as familiar. So I thought that we could start by practicing the one that's pretty familiar. So to do this work, we want to get ready by thinking about our subtopic first. So you might remember that I've been researching climate change, and a subtopic that I've been looking deeply into is the challenge that youth activists are up against. So what challenges do they face on the issue of climate change? And so last night I was thinking deeply about a specific section from one of the articles we've been reading, and I thought that I could show it to you to help us get into this work. So I want to offer some tools to help us do this perspective work. And I find it pretty helpful to make a decision about how you're going to read once. So maybe right now, you might decide this on your own, or maybe if you're working with a partner, you could talk to your partner and think, who will look for, or when will you look for structure, and when will you look for craft? If you are unfamiliar with these charts, you might just take a moment to pause the video and remind yourselves of what we look for when we're looking for structure and what we might look for when we're looking for craft moves and information texts. So if you need to, pause it and remind yourselves and make a decision for what you'll look for as I read this section of a text. Okay, so now you've reminded yourself of what to look for when you're looking for structure and what to look for when you're looking at craft. And now I'm going to scroll to a part that I thought would be pretty interesting for this. So just to remind you, this article is activist Greta Thunberg gives blistering UN speech on climate change. And I'm going to scroll to a part that I thought perspective was kind of interesting. And that's this last part here. No concrete commitments. I'm going to read it, and as I read, I want you to look for the lens, through the lens of either structure, so what structure is the author using, or what craft moves the author is using. And we're doing this to try to figure out not only what the author is trying to teach, but how, using structure or craft. Okay, so listen through your lens. No concrete commitments. Guterres had asked leaders not to come with fancy speeches, but with concrete commitments. He had offered speaking time only to countries taking strong actions. It is my obligation, our obligation, to do everything to stop the climate crisis before it stops us, Guterres said. The lack of participation by the United States was seen as a major setback. The US is the world's largest economy. It is responsible for spewing the most planet-warming emissions over time. Trump made a brief, unexpected appearance at the summit. Asked later why he had stopped by, he said, "I believe in clean air and clean water." Very simple. I'm going to pause. Remember, you're looking for structure. What structures are you seeing in this section? Or you're looking for craft. What craft moves is the author using? So maybe take a moment to think, look back. What are you noticing? I'm going to read on. The UN's World Meteorological Organization released a new report. They released it one day before the summit. It found that 2015 to 2019 is on track to be the hottest such period on record. Temperatures are already 1.1 degrees Celsius higher than in pre-industrial times, with no peak in emissions in sight. The Paris Agreement aims to keep global warming well below 2 degrees and within 1.5 degrees if possible. However, dramatically stronger actions are necessary. Otherwise, the planet will warm even faster. After her remarks, Thunberg with 15 other young people filed a formal UN complaint against 5 of the world's most powerful countries. The complaint said that the nation's failure to tackle climate change is a violation of their rights as children. More youth-led protests were planned for Friday, September 27th. I'm going to pause there. I'm going to turn us back to our tools. So you read to figure out what the author is trying to teach us, but using a lens to figure out not just what, but how. So let's think for a moment. And if you're working with a partner, you might pause this video and talk about it together. Let's just first start by thinking about the structures that we notice. So when I think about this text, one thing that I always try to figure out first is where does the information seem to be like centered? And I think about like, is it problem? Is it cause? Is it a main idea? So I'm thinking about like where this is coming from. It seems to be kind of like rooted in something that like, you know, a result of or an action that it is happening because some other stuff did or didn't happen. I'm getting some of this information from looking closely at my tool here. So I'm noticing that, or I'm thinking that cause and effect for this section seems to be the most powerful structure. I was thinking a little bit about problem solution, but I realized it's not really offering many solutions. It's kind of telling us like what happened or what might happen as a result of a lack of action. Some parts that feel really strong for me when I'm looking at it more closely, I'm thinking about how some of the language like however or otherwise kind of helps us to see that there's like a result of or a consequence. Also, just some of the choices that the author makes, even connecting back to craft. I'm seeing that the author is using some things like the protests, this all led to more youth protests, and also that Greta's comment about the violation of their rights as children. It's like a result, this like really awful consequence that they're going to have to pay for. So looking deeply at structure using my tool and also thinking about craft a bit, I'm seeing some ways that the author made this is starting to make a point here. I want to look a little bit more deeply into techniques that the author used, the craft moves here. And I'm thinking about how the author is totally using, of course, some direct quotes. So using someone like Greta, who's a very passionate speaker, who's very fierce when she's speaking publicly. I think that to me, I'm thinking now more about like, what's the point of this part? What is the author really trying to show? I think they're trying to make a point of like how serious this is, how serious the consequences are, from choosing Greta's words to also choosing specifically not just Greta, but the words like violation of their rights as children and failure to tackle climate change. Those are really, really intense and very severe things to say. So I'm thinking that cause and effect, if I'm thinking about the reasoning behind it, I'm thinking that this is trying to show us like how serious of a problem this is and like what we're up against if we don't do something and what we're already up against. And also the techniques or craft moves help me to figure out also maybe what the author believes, the perspective behind this. So I hope that you're seeing how I can use things like structure and thinking really about like what makes a structure, as well as craft moves to figure out not just what an author wants us to notice and understand, but also by looking through the lens of how. That helps us to figure out, you know, what their point is, what they really want us to see. So now I'm going to try another text, and this time I'm not going to use as much coaching. I'm just going to let you decide how you read. I'm going to read it aloud to you, and I want you to use some of the tools that I've offered to help you decide not just what the author is teaching, but how. So this is coming from a text that maybe you haven't seen me use before. It's a different one, but it's on a related subtopic because that's really how we do this work. We look at different subtopics, we look at different texts that are related on the same subtopic, and we think about ways in which these are similar or different. Back to our teaching point. How are these texts similar or different? So I'm going to read a little bit, and I want you to think again, what's the author teaching here and how do we know? So just a reminder, my subtopic that I'm still reading for is on youth activism, and specifically the challenges that youth activists face on the topic of climate change. So I'm reading this thinking about what the author is teaching here and how, and then I'm also going to start to compare and contrast the way that this article is written, the perspective here, versus what's written in the article that I already have read. So I'm going to skip down to a part that I read that kind of stuck out to me, that felt interesting for a compare and contrast. Okay, so remember, you're reading with your lens, structure or craft. The face of the Heartland Institute. Seibt is a 19-year-old German who, like Greta, is blonde, well-spoken, and European. However, Seibt condemns climate alarmism. This is an expression used by people who do not believe climate change is that bad. Some might use climate alarmism to describe scientists who say climate change will have really bad consequences around the world. Some people do not believe climate change is as bad as scientists say it is. They think scientists are saying it's worse than it really is. She's a fantastic voice for free markets and free climate realism, says James Taylor of the Heartland Institute. It is an American conservative public policy think tank. Okay, I don't know about you, but I'm already thinking about how this is on the same subtopic, but feels already wildly different. So I don't want to just jump to conclusions. I want to really think deeply about how is it different? What's the structure like? What are the craft moves? These are the ways that I'm going to have a very clear and thoughtful response, and I'll be able to truly compare and contrast the two perspectives. So I feel like it's different, but I want to be paying attention to how it's different. Heartland was founded in 1984 and funded largely by anonymous donors. It has increasingly focused on climate change over the past 10 years. Naomi Seibt versus Greta Thunberg, whom should we trust? Asked Heartland in a digital video. Heartland's tactics seem to prove that Greta has touched a nerve. In 2019, she was named Time Magazine's Person of the Year, the youngest to ever win the honor. Okay, so thoughts. Take a second, think about it. What is the author teaching in this article, in this part, and how? So rather than me walk you through it, I thought that what might be more powerful is to have you practice this either out loud with yourself, in your head, aloud, or talking it through with a partner. And so I want to offer you another way to do this and to get deeper into the work by giving you some prompts to help you compare and contrast. Let me just show you how I would get started with this. So we read now two texts on the same subtopic that have pretty different, it seems, to have pretty different ideas in them. And so you want to get to the bottom of it, like what really is the difference and how do we know? So you might use things like, these two sources are similar in the way that they both teach on the challenges that youth activists face on the issue of climate change. However, the sources differ in that one seems to represent the let's respond to climate change movement, and the other seems to be a bit more on let's focus on different issues movement. So when I look at both sources, I realize that they're both focused on powerful youth activists, their voices, and the way that they try to address their audiences. But I'm also realizing that they cover really different points of view. One text says, the other text says, you kind of see the point. So you want to push yourself to not just say big generalizations, as I'm starting to do by accident. You want to really use your tools. Think about what you've noticed or what you've learned from craft and what you've noticed and what you've learned from structure to have really well-rounded discussions about perspective and the differences and similarities that you notice across these texts. So once you try this out using the text that I presented, I want you to try this with text that you've already read for yourself, or maybe adding another one in that kind of throws everything into a loop, like how this one does. It's interesting to look at your subtopic also through the lens of perspectives that maybe you don't agree with, or that others maybe don't agree with. So it's it kind of is a fun way to push yourself to think about and consider the entire subtopic, because there's going to be different viewpoints, but also think about really how this happens. So my challenge for you today is, one, practice this with my texts. Use some of my tools and my text to have a debate with yourself or with a partner. Then try this with yours. Use a text maybe that you already know, and then use a text that maybe you don't know. And think about ways in which they are similar and different, but be specific. And you can use this to help you synthesize the information by pushing yourself to consider perspective in a really well-rounded way. I'm really excited to hear and to learn from you about the well-roundedness that you are uncovering, and also to see where you push your synthesis work. So good luck, have fun.